Hello, and welcome to Doctor Who 50 years ago, the show that looks back to Season 4 of Doctor Who in 1966 and 1967 and looks at the differences between then and now. This week, having run out of Season 4 to watch, we'll be discussing the episodes we did watch to understand what Season 4 was about. Was it Season Forgotten? TLDR, no, it isn't. I am Ben.
I am Luke.
And I'm Nick.
We have 8 questions to discuss, and we might include a certain latest series finale of the programme to debate and decipher. I'm going to say all those 8 questions in order, and then we're going to discuss them. Aren't you lucky? Question 1. What are the key themes of Season 4? Question 2. What are the top 3 episodes that we want back? That's episodes and not stories. Question 3. How did the events of 1966 and 1967 impact the episodes? Question 4, is there anything that looks like it could have been drastically censored or altered to fit the sensibilities of the time? Question 5, how was the beginning of the season different/similar to the end of the season? Question 6, what was the episode/story that seemed most out of place? 7, how does the season fit against other seasons of Doctor Who, classic and new? And finally, 8, how have the themes in Season 4 been explored in New Who, and how have they been explored differently? Number 1, key themes.
Well, the 2 themes that I think are the most prevalent here are the identity in the face of a society and doing something horrible to survive out of a fear of death. There's a very... It's not a very individual idea, both of these. Both of them really look at how you are in the context of your society and the people around you. And if you look at the Macra Terror, the Faceless Ones, Evil, and the 10th Planet, they're all people having to do something horrible to themselves to change who they are, to stay in a society out of that fear of death. The fact that dying as a person and as a race is the most horrible thing you can do.
It's very well connected. I know this jumps to another different question entirely, but it's very well connected to the Cold War ideals of the time. But I know with becoming something horrible to survive with the Cybermen, it's mainly to do with health and survival through there to extend mortality and things like that.
I guess there must have been much more of a threat of a horrible annihilation to your entire species back then. So these would have been on everyone's minds.
So my key themes would be generational conflict and societal change. So if we're saying generational conflict, probably the best one I could think of to highlight this might be the Faceless Ones. So you've got the young Liverpudlian girl. What's her name, Ben?
Samantha.
So she goes to the police and no one listens to her. And the people in authority are the older people, but she's ultimately correct to be worried. The Doctor is younger, but he's not really the younger generation, but I suppose in terms of age or how he looks, but he acts like one. He's got the Beatles haircut. Jamie as well is also generational conflict. So they're all representing younger people, and they are ignored by the establishment in the Faceless Ones. Yeah, and then then reflect on societal change. So the 10th Planet. So with the Cybermen, it's a rather depressing sort of view because they evolved on a planet that went the wrong way, but we have gone in a better way. Technology has led to a better world where they don't need many people on the snow-capped base in the Antarctic because computers can do it all mostly. But also we've got a world space program, although they don't mention the Soviet Union, but whatever. We'll just pretend they're in it. So there's a lot more international cooperation, which is very much what the youth of 1966 would want the world to go towards, this sort of end of the Cold War and peace. So that's sort of depicting quite a not utopian, but quite a, so that's sort of more that way kind of worldview.
Yeah, a positive outlook on the future, yes. And
yes.
It's also extended into Jerry Davis and Kit Pedler's second story, The Moon Base, which has its international crew on the moon looking after the weather, because that's something that can unite humanity, the weather. And it's also explored, albeit to a lesser extent, in The Faceless Ones, the fact that people can go abroad with cheap budget airlines, and so that persuades the young to go out and explore the world, even if it is in a touristy fashion. Becoming something horrible to survive, identity, generational conflict, internationalism, but most of all, change. Key themes for season 4. Of the top 3 episodes we want back, I have picked The Smugglers episode 1, basically to see what the last historicals looked like. I know it's pretty controversial, but I just live on the hope and optimism that it might not be as bad as we have heard it to be in the audio and the reconstructions. I've also chosen Power episode 1 because Troughton, and Evil episode 7 because explosions, action, and contrast between the first episode of the season, Smugglers 1, and the last episode of the season in this long season of change.
Nick, do you have Power 1 and Evil 7 as well?
I do indeed. However,
Right.
Yes, so we all agree with your reasoning, Ben, on Power 1 and Evil 7. But instead of Smugglers 1, I would pick Evil 4 because it's such a visual episode. Jamie's having to starts the fight between Jamie and the
Kemal,
the Turkish guy, and he has to go through this obstacle course through this mansion in order to get to Victoria, the damsel in distress. And with the pictures that you get, it looks really quite well directed, and probably would be quite pacey and very action heavy, which is quite rare for Doctor Who in the 60s. So it's a real shame that you can't see it, because it is pretty hard to get into it with just pictures when it is that visual.
The one I've picked is, of course, the Macra Terror Part 1, because I love that story. And not just because I love it, I also think that it will do the double purpose of having really great direction, introducing people to the story, and also aiding the reconstructions on the following 3 episodes, should Loose Cannon ever decide to do such a thing. I know that's a triple one, but whatever. I think it would be interesting to see how they would do it, and I think that everyone else would find it interesting, and therefore would find the rest of the serial interesting as well.
Go the Macra Terror.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Moving on to number 3, how did the events of 1966 and 67 impact the episodes?
Well, I already touched upon this earlier about how this was a time of change, and also very much change led by the post-war generation. And I think probably the single biggest, the defining moment for the youth, especially in America, but also here, was, in Britain, I should say, was the Vietnam War. That sort of galvanized a generation around a big issue. They wanted change, and they didn't like the direction that their leaders were taking them. And then Vietnam was such a callback to more towards the 50s, the 40s, before the war. Meddling in other countries, the US kind of getting very almost imperialistic in its trying to impose itself on another country. And to people born after the war who just just don't want that. They want cooperation between nations. They want peace. Really encouraged left-wing thinking, which encouraged social change.
I'm going to say exactly that, but I'm also going to link it to the various writers of the various stories, in particular Pedler and Davis, who use the concept of internationalism, the space race, because those events are happening during this era, as well as the fight for survival ideas in the 10th Planet and the Moon Base. But also I'm going to include in Stuart Black, who introduced us to swinging 60s London in the War Machines, but that's beyond our purview. But he definitely introduced the concept of generational conflict and just rebellion and revolution to the max in the Macro Terror.
The thing about the 60s is that you had a wonderful scientific optimism where you had people deciding that they wanted to build their own island, and you were starting to get sex change operations and that. And we see that scientific optimism being corrupted in Power of the Daleks and The Underwater Menace, and to some extent in The Faceless Ones. And when scientists are going further and further, I'm glad that it will always be the job of writers to say, maybe this is a terrible, horrifying idea. Let's scare people with it. And I think it's good that in this series, which is questioning authority, it's questioning how scientists are working and what their aims could be should they not be kept in check.
And this is also happening in New Who with stories about Wi-Fi and emojis. A humongous amount of events influencing the episodes of Doctor Who in Season 4. We've got international things, we've got the progress of technology, we've got progressive ideals as influenced by the youth versus the old guard. All of this can be seen in the various episodes of Season 4 of Doctor Who. Question 4, moving on to violence and violent things. Was there anything that could have been drastically censored or altered to fit the sensibilities of the time? The only thing I can think of is the violent nature of things in The Smugglers and the Highlanders.
To counter that, I would say, so the violence that you see in the Smugglers and the Highlanders is the sort of swashbuckling variety, which was more traditional, but also sanitized. It's not, you're not blood all over the place. It's not very realistic. I would say that the moment that stands out to me as the most horrific, sort of unnecessarily and probably most jarringly with the audience, is in the Underwater Menace, with the operation that they have with the fish people. You don't really see it on screen, but it is mentioned, and it sort of feels a bit out of place in that whole serial. And it does nearly happen to Polly, so I think that kind of drives home how. But it doesn't seem to gel with any of the rest of the serial. Someone feels out of place, rather than with the 10th Planet, where it's mentioned by the Cybermen that they used to be like people, but it's never really. They never allude to how it was done or whatever, and it's all very much like it's more of a that would only scare the adults, which is fine. It's scaring the children, whilst the fish people are very obvious.
I think we can basically summarise this entire question with the Underwater Menace. It was mad, and thus completely out of the range of the rest of the season. It is also related, yes, with our next question of how the beginning of season was different / similar to the end. I'm going to compare the Smugglers to the Evil of the Daleks. Evil of the Daleks is an epic to a greater degree than the War Machines in Season 3, The Time Meddler Season 2, or The Dalek Invasion of Earth, technically Season 1, was. Whilst the season opener of The Smugglers is like The Mask of Mandragora, in that little is established and a generic story takes place to the season's detriment. Smugglers is indicative of the Hartnell era, of slow-paced historicals which receive mixed coverage but ultimately get bad press. Because of the new wave ushered in by the Troughton era of action stories with bases under siege and evil making season finales, but also is a transitional period from Hartnell to Troughton, which Nick and Luke are going to talk about.
So what I will say is, so how the season starts. You start with the Smugglers, which is very much a holdover from the Hartnell era. It is a very traditional Hartnell story. And then you get the 10th Planet. You get the beginning of this transition period, because the 10th Planet is not a traditional Hartnell story, and it does start to seed in. You see the beginning of some of the elements that will take place later in the season, although Hartnell's still very much himself in it. And this transition period, I would say, lasts until the moon base. I would say the moment I could pinpoint the moment right down to when he makes the terrible things in the universe that we must fight speech. From then on, Doctor Who, as we know it now, is pretty much, that's when it was formed.
Well, it's interesting that you divide the series in the way that you just said that, because I divide the series almost down the middle for similar reasons. I divide it into Smugglers to Underwater Menace and Moonbase to Evil, because in the first half of those, the Doctor is much more angry and he isn't receptive to those around him, really. I'd say even in the Moonbase, there's a lot of him sneaking around, not really talking to people, not really saying what his aims and methods are. But the more in that story that he seems to know Robson and get on with him, the more he seems to loosen up. And I think that's what really helps the Moonbase. After that, you get a much more relatable, banterous Doctor. Robson and Jamie both force the Doctor to be much more friendly. And I think that's the major change throughout this series.
Yeah. To summarise, we believe that there are more differences than similarities between the beginning of Season 4 and the end of Season 4. And to quote another regeneration story, a new body is like a new house. It takes time to settle in. There is a transitional period. We debate and what's the word? We're divided on when that transitional period lasts, but it happens. It happens. Regarding the episode that seems most out of place, here comes the Underwater Menace again, because it was hastily put together at the end of, again, this transitional period we're going to describe, in which Troughton attempts to settle in, doing his role as the Doctor. But I'm also going to include the Highlanders, because it seems to be a farce made during the Christmas period.
Well, what do you mean by it being a farce, Ben?
Well, Troughton plays the role seemingly more comedically, and he plays it in a more pantomime-esque fashion, what with the disguises and such like. Before January comes in, the plot reasserts itself with episode 4, and a lot of action happens. And the story was redeemed in our eyes.
Well,
very by an infinitesimal amount, but still.
Conversely, I would say that for me, the most out of place serial is The Smugglers, and I think this has a lot to do with the fact that it was held over from season 3. So it feels very much like a traditional Hartnell story, as I've said before, and it has none of the themes that you can see in pretty much almost every other serial this season. And it isn't even written in a similar way to any of the. It's a lot more slowly paced than the rest of the season. That's another significant thing about season 4, is that it's a lot faster paced than most of the show up to this point.
I have to agree with Nick on this one. Whenever I'm thinking about this season or making some notes on it, The Smugglers always seems like this weird outlier. The Underwater Menace doesn't feel like Doctor Who, but it sort of weirdly lumps itself in with a lot of what the season is doing. can't say that about the Smugglers. It's such an outlier to me, and also it's probably the worst one as well.
Mm. To summarise, thank goodness it was dealt with extremely quickly back in September. Question 7. How does this season fit against other seasons of Doctor Who? Well, I say that in establishing the new Doctor and creating this transitional period from one Doctor to the next, this season does fit extensively against the other new Doctor openers, which dedicate their entire plot to said stories, like Spearhead from Space, Robot, and Castrovalva. It embraces change.
So, is this the season where the most changed compared to 7, 12, 19, and 22 and 24?
I would say, for me personally, the only other season that has as much change as this one is season 7.
Yes.
I would say, yeah, this is very much a reboot, pretty much, of the show. And 7 is also a reboot of the show in that you compare the War Games to Spearhead from Space. Completely different. But 12... No, not 12. Season 12. So season 12 and season 19. Whilst they're both very different, so the beginning and end of Tom Baker's era is very different, what you see is that it's a gradual change. So 11 to 12 are not that different, but 18, 19 are also very similar. So they try and make it more gradual as time goes on.
Bringing up season 7, I find that in that one there's very much a disgust of authority in that one, and for what the Brigadier stands for. And Liz, being the relative grunt in that, starts to stick up for herself and becomes the subject of the Doctor's affections. This is very similar to this season, where you have the authority figures largely being sneered at, while the people on the ground are sort of subject to a lot of their whims, and the Doctor is fighting against that. I think thematically they're very similar. So it's interesting that the two Doctors in question hate each other, when in fact I think that what Pertwee ended up being is one of the more radical shifts in the character compared to Troughton, who basically stayed the same once they'd figured him out. Pertwee very much gets subsumed into UNIT and the things he was fighting against at the start. So it makes sense that he would have problems with Troughton.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, if season 7 Pertwee had met Troughton, I think it might be a different story.
I would say that it also fits quite well in the periods between 85 and 88, when in Trial of the Time Lord you have the Doctor shouting all the time at the Inquisitor. In season 24 you have fake bad Troughton as the Doctor, and then in season 25 you have stuff like the Happiness Patrol, where he tries to break the Guinness World Record of quickest destruction of a society.
Right, okay. It's employing themes that have already been established. So it fits against other seasons in that it's paying homage or pastiches of them. Yes. How have the themes we've seen in season 4 been explored in New Who, and how have they been explored differently? I would have said that internationalism and pro-human rights and pro-inclusivity of everything in the universe dominates New Who, specifically in Series 10. And whilst Classic Who promotes equality of all men and women, sometimes, New Who promotes positivism, deals with difficult choices referring to life and death, and is especially more anti-war compared with Classic Who, where conflicts are more accepted as part of the norm heck, the inclusion of UNIT. But this is a thing that gradually dies out throughout the 80s and 90s.
I would say New is even well. Classic Who always had the lofty rhetoric of equality. It usually was quite good on things like race or class, but in terms of gender equality, or at least sex equality, between men and women, it was always a bit lacking, especially in that, there are lots of serials, especially in the 60s and the 70s, where the only female actor or actress, whatever they want to be called, is in it is the companion. But New Who is very much, especially under Moffat, very aware of this, but it still struggles with actually doing it without doing it correctly. If you know what I mean? Where he knows that it needs to be done, that women should be treated equally, but he sort of has to make it too obvious that he's doing it just for that, rather than just making a good story about women in it. I think one of the best depictions of women in Doctor Who is the Brain of Morbius, because they're a sisterhood, it could be a bunch of monks rather than women. The fact that they're women doesn't make a difference in the story, really, does it? But they're still, they would be just as scary. But it's just, that's what I like, is that it isn't, oh look, we've got women in it, look how good we are. So
that's interesting.
I feel like when Classic Who did equality, it did it in a way without trying to be too shouty about it, whilst New Who is very much aware of the societal pressure on it.
I think that anti-authoritarianism in New Who is very, very odd, because there's such a flat structure to everything. Time Lords are no longer a class, but a race, and everyone obeys the Doctor all of the time because he is the law. And you might have the odd caricature of a capitalist in there, but it never comes off as all that genuine. This season, for me, being about the face of yourself in society, you have stuff like that occasionally, but it's all very much mired in pop culture references, like the Wi-Fi Spoonheads episode, sort of, where it was about people being attached to their tablets too much or something. It was never... I don't really feel it's as philosophical as this season can be in places. I don't think it will last as much. I mean, I really have to strain to remember the title of Bells of St. John. Wow, that episode barely exists to me. Yeah, I think it's become a lot more diluted and simpler. I think a lot of sci-fi has become a lot simpler in that regard. If you look at Star Trek, where Starfleet Academy is now just the training base rather than the upper echelon. There's no longer that upper echelon that there should be in these things. The Doctor isn't even upper class anymore. It's silly.
So there is a standardization of things in New Who compared to a more nuanced perspective in Classic Who. Does that sound right?
Yeah, it's a lot more realistic in the sense of it accepts hard choices, hard facts of society, whereas New Who tends to be much more, not optimistic is the wrong word, just sort of puts a pillow over its face and ignores them a lot of the time.
So in your view, New Who needs to be more combative of these ideals?
Yeah, I feel that Doctor Who was always supposed to be very combative and sneer at people, and even at itself. I mean, that's what made a lot of the changes between the shows so interesting to watch. Whereas, if we're looking at Chibnall, everyone's saying that he's going to go back to a much more RTD style of doing things, and this will save the show. I have a feeling that classic Doctor Who would rather have died than do that.
what we have seen to gather from this discussion questions, all 8 of them, is that this season revolves around various forms of change. It's linked to the various events that occurred in 1966 and 1967, and as we've seen in the podcast, looks at the differences between those events and the events now, and how they relate to New Who, and how it's performed, and there are different changes between Classic and New Who there. But ultimately, I think the main thing we can see with season 4 of Doctor Who, which was Doctor Who 50 years ago, is that change is needed to survive, and survival is a good thing, right?
Mm.
Yeah, it's one of the best serials. Yeah.
Yes. What a terrible joke. Yes, well done. Yes. Yes, that is the whole point of Doctor Who 50 years ago from our points of view. Thank you very much for watching and listening. We shall remain on Blogspot as an empty husk, which will direct you to iTunes, where podcast forms of the episodes exist. The Facebook group will remain in stasis, as will the YouTube channel and other internety things, including Google+, if you dare. But once again, thank you one and all. I've been Ben.
I have been Luke.
And I've been Nick.
Life depends on change and renewal. Never forget that, Doctor Who.
Nice.
That was my attempt to be sentimental.
That's a good one.
Good night.